we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to take these findings and we're going to start to put them in context, because it's not just the 90th anniversary of Social Security, which we'll be marking all year at the Academy, and we're already up to lots of active scheming with many of you for doing that in lots of special ways. But this is also a really important moment in the Social Security solvency conversation. And we have a new administration, we have a new Congress, but we also have lots of conversations happening in Washington about how we don't have that long to address this financing gap. And so to help us put these findings in context and to take them into the Washington moment, I'm going to give each of you a chance just to say who you are and where you're from before we get into it. And Jason, one of our newest senior fellows at the Academy, why don't we start with you?
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I wear like 10,000 hats. So basically, I am the executive director of the Retirement Income Institute at the Alliance for Lifetime Income, and I have a variety of fellowships, the Bipartisan Policy Center here at the National Academy of Social Insurance, Stanford, Washington University in St. Louis. I'm on the board of directors of the FINRA Foundation, and I'm the chair of the Puerto Rico Pension Reserve Trust.
Jason has at times been accused of being a hat collector. I won't quote the person who said that. Kathleen, over to you next.
Hello, I'm Kathleen Romig. I'm at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, leading the Social Security and SSI work there.
So glad to have you here. Wendell.
I'm Wendell Primus. I'm glad to be here this morning. I'm a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and for 18 years I was Nancy Pelosi's health and budget person.
So glad to have you here, Wendell. And you've got lots coming on these issues as well, so it's very timely to have you in this conversation. Tracey.
Hello, I'm Tracey Gronniger. I am the Managing Director of Economic Security and Housing at Justice and Aging, where we advocate for low-income older adults.
And also a member of the Academy's board, as is Jason, which he didn't say. And last but not least, we're keeping Joel Eskovitz on the stage with us.
I refuse to leave. Yeah, sorry.
We don't let Joel off the stage. Joel's just going to keep hanging out with us. So I'm going to give each of you the chance before we start to talk a little bit more about the current debate, but you can go ahead and make that segue if you'd like in your answers. But I do want to do sort of a down the line of giving each of you the chance to react to the survey findings. And I'll ask the question, what was the biggest takeaway for you, and were you surprised by any of the findings? And Joel, since you've already gotten a chance at that, I'm going to go to Tracey.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the previous panelists hit on some of the takeaways and surprises, but I think that for me, looking at, low-income older adults primarily, my biggest takeaway was that it's not just a program for low-income older adults. Like, we see that people across the board and across various income levels, demographics, gender, everyone really depends on Social Security, and I think that that really came through in the findings.
Yeah, Wendell, same question to you.
I don't think there was any surprises. I guess one of the questions I would pose, again, there was they wanted no cuts in benefits, but if you looked at Social Security, let's say, versus Medicare and providing home health care benefits, what is the most important thing that the elderly need as they approach retirement and live a long time? And the other thing I would say about retirement age, the thing that I'm most astonished at is how much longer high earners live relative to low earners. I mean, that difference is really astonishing.
All things I know you'll get into as you start to preview your own Social Security plan that will be coming out soon. Kathleen, same question to you.
I think the conventional wisdom on Social Security is that the American people always want to get more and pay less, which obviously does not add up when you have a shortfall. But I think one thing that this survey revealed is that people can get serious about trade-offs. And I definitely echo what Chantel said about the $250 a month increase, that was surprisingly a negative for the majority of people in terms of the package. They really did want the numbers to add up. And likewise with taxation of benefits, which is something that came up a lot on the campaign trail, that when people had to get real about, well, what would this do to the program's financing, it was not popular.
Yeah, and I know we'll get more into that, but what a great point. And Jason, you it's not the last word, it's just the next word, but you get the next one.
So I think part of this is what we should not be surprised about is we've seen this throughout history in the U.S. is people, once they get a benefit, do not want it taken away. And I think that's very clear. And we've seen that survey after survey. And once you start something, it's very hard to change or to get rid of it. And so it's not a surprise that people want to maintain benefits and don't want to cut in their benefits. it's also not surprising that people are willing to tax other people for their benefits, right? So raise taxes on the rich, don't tax me. The big surprise, though, was the support for raising the payroll tax, 1% on the employer, 1% on the employee for everybody. And I think that's part of the conversation that has to happen, because revenues have to be part of the equation for any solvency issue. And if it's just tax the rich, well, then you get into the fight over how do you tax people, and you get stuck where you are. But if people are willing to raise taxes on themselves, then that is a good place to start, and that is something that was surprising for me with the survey.
I'm so glad you took us there, and so I'm going to stay with you, Jason, and you're going to get the next word, and because I'd love to just get your thoughts on this. So why, in your opinion, is there such a gap between where the Washington conversation and that conventional wisdom is, and where voters are, especially when it comes to revenue?
Well, I think part of this, and Wendell probably have opinions being on the Hill for so long as well, is that I think for Republicans who, as an ideology, are opposed to tax increases, have been opposed for so long, they're not willing to talk about it and are willing to deal with it. And their perception has been, if we get closer and closer to trust fund depletion date, and the delta gets larger and larger solving this problem just on revenues, the American people will not accept a large tax increase alone to solve it. Where Democrats are thinking, hey, we don't want to reduce benefits at all, even part of a package. And if we get closer and closer to trust fund depletion, nobody's going to want a 20% benefit cut overnight. Can you imagine if that actually happened? And then all the seniors start marching up to Capitol Hill with pitchforks? That's not going to happen. So I think basically what you see is there's this chicken, game of chicken going on. Is what's going to happen, but of course, the longer we wait, the larger the change has to be. But we need to have some sort of conversation about a compromise, and the voters seem to be there, but the parties don't yet seem to be.
Yeah, and Wendell, I want to take that same question to you. You and I have had a number of conversations about this, but I know you are one person in particular who is quite frustrated by what the size of the gulf we see between lawmakers on this issue. I think perhaps the biggest surprise and takeaway to me is, this is a time of what feels like incredible division among the American people, among this country when it comes to many issues, and in particular the size and role of government. And yet, even amidst all of this division, we see the American people united when you ask them around this particular issue, and yet that's not what we see in Washington. So why the gulf between lawmakers, Wendell? Anything you want to add to Jason's point?
Well, thanks for that question. Saving Social Security, the funds become depleted, the OASI fund in 2033 by both the chief actuary and CBO, and saving that is a good thing. But actually doing it is political pain. You can only get there by reducing benefits or cutting taxes, raising taxes, and there's no other way, and that is political pain. We also have, in my opinion, unsustainable budget deficits right now. Approaching $2 trillion a year. That is unheard of. And, eventually we're going to have to deal with that. And I would argue very strongly that this Congress should fix Social Security, restore solvency, what I mean by that, before you give $4 trillion away to the wealthy in the tax cut.
Joel, anything you want to add to this particular sticky wicket we find ourselves in? They've put a lot on the table, but I know you have thoughts as well.
Well, I think the other piece of this that has been interesting to me following some of the debate on the Hill has been around the age. I think a lot of people talk about raising the age as, it's one of those things that if you talk to somebody just out in the world and they say, oh, they just raised the age, that'll solve the problem. I think as you saw in the survey, people did not really cotton to that at all. And in fact, in the last survey, we asked up until 70. And even if you've seen proposals floated in the last few years, people throw out ages 71, 70, and every one of those proposals, they end up bringing the age down. It is less and less popular as the years go by. So that, I think, is interesting as we now are getting to basically 67 for all. People now see what that means to work until 67. They do not want that age to go up. So that's another interesting piece of it, because I think that has been an area where some folks have said, oh, I can work a lot longer, so why do I need, I can work into my 70s, so the age should be higher. Well, I think that increasingly people see that that's not always the case.
So, Kathleen, one of the things that I know doesn't get talked about nearly as much, but does feel like a current moment issue that should be talked about, is the disability component of Social Security. Social Security includes not just retirement protection, but also disability protection, as well as survivors, obviously. And the disability benefits get perhaps less attention sometimes than the retirement protections. That was part of why we asked some of those questions. Were you surprised by the findings in terms of what disability benefits mean to people and their importance to workers and families' incomes? And how do you see that as relevant in this moment, given some of the potential threats we see on the horizon?
Yeah, I think like retirement, disability is something that it becomes more salient to each of us as we get closer and closer to retirement and older, and more look around ourselves and see more of our own peers, our family members becoming disabled and needing more support than they had really anticipated or hoped. And so I'm not surprised, given that people experience this in their lives, that they come to understand the importance not only of Social Security retirement, but of Social Security disability as well. And I think, particularly because we know disability rates really increase as people age, it's important to look at the proposals that are likely coming our way in terms of older workers. We know that at the end of the last Trump administration, there was a draft rule that would have significantly constrained eligibility for older workers in particular for SSDI. And so I think, understanding that people are tuned into this, they do understand it through their own lived experience, the importance of disability benefits, and the fact that disability could strike you, a member of your family, and could imperil your livelihood. I think it's really important that we take a close look at these proposals if they do resurface, and particularly how they will affect older workers and older applicants, because that, if it's not already one of us, it could be.
Thank you for that, Kathleen. And the finding that was related in there, since there were many this morning, just to recap, was that I think it was 90% of Americans said that they expect to need Social Security's disability insurance if they become disabled and unable to support themselves through work. So an extraordinary high number who understand Social Security includes disability protections. Tracey, a related set of questions that we asked, which I feel like also often get buried in conversations about Social Security, were about SSI. And you knew I couldn't resist putting some questions on SSI in the poll, but obviously not part of the conversation about solvency, because SSI is not funded by the trust fund, and so, but still a very important part of the Social Security system. Were you surprised by the bipartisan support for SSI improvements, and what opportunities do you see when it comes to that part of Social Security?
So I think in some ways I was both surprised and not surprised. Surprised in the sense that I think historically people assumed that there was just a lot of disdain for SSI. There were misconceptions about the program. And in some ways, you expect there to be some hostility towards the program in general. I think that we've kind of done work over the course of the past 5+ years to really tell people more about the program, what it's for, how it works. And when you tell people what the program is about, people understand that and it makes sense to them. And then when you tell them what the current rules and regulations are, that sounds wrong and that doesn't make sense to them. And so the proposals that we put forward seem logical. One of the things that I think as Americans we are not taught is that we shouldn't save for emergencies. So when you tell someone that people will be penalized for saving too much, that doesn't sound right. And when you tell people, for example, that if they get married, they'll lose money, that doesn't sound right. And so I think that for the proposals that we're putting forward, most people think that they make sense. And I think that that's the way that we start to fix sort of the problems that we're seeing that we have been neglecting for so long. If you leave a program for decades, things are going to get out of whack. And so I think that, to the extent that we are talking about proposals that just feel really logical and make sense, they're going to resonate with the public and people are going to support them and think that it makes sense.
Things like updating savings penalties, things like reforming marriage penalties. Jason, I think it was you who once pointed out that SSI's asset limit is the most regressive anti-savings measure in federal law today, and that's something I know you've done a lot of work on as well. Do you have any thoughts about the bipartisanship, or were you surprised to see the bipartisanship among voters for reforming that policy and for exempting retirement accounts from the asset limit?
Well, I think in one way, like you said, it's very regressive. It also hasn't been updated in so long. It's not even been updated for inflation. And so we update so many things in the tax code and our benefit code for inflation. We should do the same thing with the SSI asset limits. And when you mention that to people, they go, oh, of course we should. It just seems like, why aren't we? So it seems like a no-brainer, and I think we should get something like that through Congress. I was in some ways surprised that retirement accounts should be excluded because basically SSI is for the very, very poor, right? So people understand there should be asset limits. And so the question is, where do you draw a line? So I was a little surprised. But again, retirement is one of those things like, well, yeah, of course you should be saving for retirement, so why should we penalize you for it?
Wendell, I want to let you comment on this as well, because you are somebody, I feel like many of us have had conversations with you at different points. You are somebody who has been beating the drum for a while, saying it's really important to talk about SSI as part of Social Security. And as we have these conversations about what should be in a Social Security solvency package, even though SSI is not funded by the trust funds and is not necessary to include in a solvency package, there is some real logic for including some of these reforms in that context. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. One is we're rolling out a Social Security plan on February 11th, but then about a month later, we're going to have a large paper on how to reduce the elderly poverty rate. And one thing that I think is, I think there's many changes we ought to make to SSI. One is the participation rate is only 50%. You've talked about the asset limits. The other thing is I think there's really not a very good interaction between Social Security and SSI. I mean, after a little small dollar disregard, when you calculate the SSI benefit, and you get Social Security, it's dollar for dollar reduction. Every dollar of Social Security reduces your SSI benefit by $1. I think we should have like a 40% disregard of Social Security benefits, and that way it would help many more people just elderly below the poverty line get over the poverty line if we had a better disregard. So, and in the 1983 amendments, when we did the last major update in terms of solvency to Social Security, there were increases in the SSI benefit level. And I think the same thing when we address the Social Security program and its solvency, we also ought to at the same time really think hard about how to reduce elderly poverty, what to do about the SSI program.
Thank you for that, and I know we're all interested in seeing your Social Security proposal that will come out soon. Joel, I want to go to you. Oh, and actually I should note, we didn't have a slide on this, but we do have a finding in the poll asking about those income limits, which also have not been updated for a long time. As Jason mentioned, the asset limits haven't been updated even for inflation, and I think that's since 1984, but the income limits have never been updated for inflation, not since 1972 when the program was legislated. Strong bipartisan support for updating those income limits for inflation as well. And we didn't have a slide on that because Matt had so many slides to contend with that we didn't want to give him yet more. Joel, I want to bring you back in. Tracey hit on this just briefly, but I know this is something you think a lot about. Social Security is often talked about as an anti-poverty program, but I think one of the things that really comes through loud and clear in these findings is that it's really important to the economic security of people across the income spectrum, even well up to, I think we saw only 7% of people over $200,000 in household income were saying it wouldn't be important to them. You all did a series of interviews with members recently, and I'm curious if you want to share a little bit about some of the things that you heard and also its importance to people who are more middle class.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up the thread that you started about, people saying that's not right, it's not. There are two themes that I think really register both in the poll but also in the interviews. And I think because almost every American is invested in this, literally invested in the system, they have a real sense of right and wrong and fairness about how the benefits are divvied up. And so when you talk to people, I mean, the tax max is a great example. When we're talking to people, some people don't have any idea that that exists. And so when they find out about that, if it's not happened to you, if you don't make that much money and you understand that, oh, people stop paying into Social Security at a certain part of the year, they find that incredibly unfair. The other thing that I found interesting in this most recent group of interviews was everyone kept using the phrase, I earned this. They also kept saying, this isn't an entitlement. And which was, music to my ears, because that's something that we always try to say, that people really do feel a sense of ownership over this. And it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, or, you've paid into the system and you want everyone to get their fair amount. And I think that it's a universal program, and it just, everyone from every walk of life has some sort of ownership over it, which I thought was such an interesting, sense of kind of a collective feeling around the program.
And I'm so much looking forward to seeing more of the videos that are going to be released throughout the year. We've started today with hearing from Elizabeth, but actually on the Academy's webpage where the report lives, we also have a video from George, also an AARP member, and we're going to be partnering with you guys to continue to put those out throughout the year for the 90th anniversary. Wendell, I want to turn back to you quickly because immigration and treatment of immigrants is shall we say, something of a very hot issue right now in this moment. And it's been featuring prominently since the presidential campaign. I don't think we're going to expect that to stop anytime soon. How does immigration relate to Social Security? This was something you wanted to speak about this morning.
Well, thank you for that question. I would urge everyone to read this report that just came out of CBO entitled The Demographic Outlook 2025 to 2055.
No, just got to use
it. Sorry about that. So after 2033, the increase in population in this country is all related to net immigration. And I think the conversation has to change from what's happening at the border. And, Trump believes he got elected because of all the rhetoric around that. But when the baby boom generation reaches its peak demand for long-term care services, where do we think the home health aides are going to come from? The American Hospital Association already says we're 200,000 nurses short. So I believe we have got to increase legal immigration levels to solve some of our workforce shortages. And it would also do great things for the budget deficit, as well as for the solvency of the Social Security system. I mean, this report, the CBO report, says our fertility rate is at 1.6 for the foreseeable future. And again, the conversation around immigration, in my humble opinion, really needs to change, and we've got to be worried about workforce. Dick Durbin talks about this frequently, and it isn't only in the long-term care industry or the health industry, it's also in agriculture and other places.
Thank you for that, Wendell. Wendell has homework for all of you. I hope that you're writing that down. You have reading recommendations, but really important to connect that to this conversation. Jason, I want to go to you next because another hot button issue that we heard on the campaign trail and which we're now hearing more about and which may come up in the tax debate this year is the idea of ending taxation of Social Security benefits. And that was something we actually put in the poll because we were curious what the American people would say about that idea. Can you talk a little bit about what effect that would have on the financing gap and anything we should know about that policy, which the poll did not find a lot of support for?
So what's been interesting recently, especially with the Social Security Fairness Act, getting rid of the WEP GPO, was we're going in the opposite direction of solvency. We're making things worse. And while, again, reducing taxes is very politically popular because no one likes paying them, to do so would worsen trust fund solvency by at least a year or more. It would decrease and worsen the trust fund solvency by a quarter, 25%. And it could cost over 10 years between 1.6 and 1.8 trillion dollars. So it's a very expensive proposal. And as Wendell says, we're talking about $4 trillion, talking about looking at extension of the tax cuts. This starts adding up over time. And I think one of the things to realize too, when we start talking about options, is that, so when I was the Deputy Commissioner of Social Security, I worked on the trustees reports that come out every year. I signed 3 of them, 2008, 2009, and 2010. So that's 15 years ago. But there is a cost of delaying. So 15 years ago, when I signed those reports, if we wanted to solve Social Security solvency on a 75-year basis, just on revenues, at that point in time, we could have lifted the payroll tax cap, not changed the rate, just lifted the cap, and that would have solved 75-year solvency. Now it doesn't. And we have to do other options along the way, which gets into trade-offs, whether it's on benefits or alternate revenues or something else along the way. Each year we delay, that magnitude gets harder and harder, and your options get more limited, and you have to do more of this trade-off along the way. And this becomes very important when thinking about what we want to do with Social Security, whether it's payroll taxes, whether it's retirement age, whether it's more benefits, less benefits, how we do this. And so having these discussions about trying to get rid of taxation of Social Security benefits, which sounds good politically, would be very, very costly to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. Joel, is there anything else you want to say about that? I know that was, it was an interesting question to test and an interesting one to see the American people not really jumping at.
Well, I just wanted to add on to the point about, the timing of everything, because this was the first time that we had asked about, getting money from elsewhere, right? Because it's not just, in the short term, basically, there's not a whole lot you can do on the benefit side that would kick in fast enough to avoid a big benefit cliff in 2034. And that's why we asked questions around, well, what happens if, even if we've reached an agreement in 2032 to, save Social Security, but it hasn't kicked in fast enough. And there's another question that wasn't on the slides that was, we asked people straight up, would you want the government to just borrow money and keep benefits? And half the people said, yeah, we would do that, even if you didn't pay it back. And then another quarter, I think, said, we would do that, but you should pay it back. And, that was kind of surprising to me that people, in the Social Security space, I think lots of people are much more fixated on, this is a self-funded system. We want to be out of the appropriations business, which I totally understand. But, for Americans, they don't see that distinction so much. They just want to make sure that they have their benefits. So yes, and I agree that on the taxation side, obviously that moves us in a different direction, and you would need to replace that revenue in some form or fashion.
All great plugs for reading the report, because all the things that are getting talked about that maybe did not find their way into the slides because we didn't have time for everything are in that report. Tracey, I want to go to you next, and then after another couple of questions, we're going to open it up to audience questions, because I imagine you guys have questions and comments that you'd like to make as well. And our pollster, Matt Greenwald, is still here, and so if folks have questions for him, he's available too. Mike? It's back. Thank you. Tracey, back to you. We heard just a little bit on the earlier panel from Tyler about the caregiver credit, but I know this is really important to justice and aging and something that you think a lot about as well. Is there anything you wanted to add to how that fits in as one of the most popular enhancements that people wanted to see in that preferred package?
Yeah, I think that one of the things, as we're looking from justice and aging's perspective about, how we can advocate for low-income older adults and people who may not be historically part of groups that have been represented, looking at caregivers and thinking about who are primarily women, thinking about what they have contributed to sort of the economy, to communities, and how that then affects their ability to be economically secure in retirement is something that's really important to us. And we put out a paper a few years ago about older women in poverty. We updated it and did another paper with National Women's Law Center, where waving at people there. And we really talked about the fact that we see women putting in a lot of time, work, and energy that then reduces their Social Security benefits and puts them more likely to live in poverty as they age. And so the caregiver credit, I think, it does reflect the fact that people understand that there is something that is being contributed by caregivers, and that it's important that we don't then leave them behind and say, well, thanks so much for all that, unpaid labor and income. Good luck to you in your retirement. And so I think that that is something that is really important to keep in mind, and that I think the public does understand.
Yeah, I have to say, it's been so interesting doing preview briefings with a handful of folks before this one today. And of all the things that jump out to people, that's the one where people go, oh my God, this is so overdue. And also, can't it be a caregiver credit for other types of care work? And we said, that wasn't scored yet. We're working on that. So lots of interest in that one. Kathleen, one thing I need to throw over to you before we open it up to audience questions is, as we think about the moment in time we find ourselves in and the current state of play for the Social Security Administration, in addition to the challenges that we're already talking about in terms of the financing gap, Social Security has been facing a customer service crisis for quite some time. And it's something that the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has focused a lot on, that AARP has focused a lot on, because you hear a lot from your members. We have folks here from the Urban Institute who have done a lot of work on this, Justice and Aging as well. Talk a little bit about what we should be watching on this front as we have a new administration coming in and transitions happening. And is this something you expect to be a priority in the new political landscape?
Thank you for raising that. It's really important. The Trump administration has been saying that it's important to not only preserve Social Security benefits, but also preserve access to those benefits. And you see that in the executive orders that they've been putting out. So, for example, the one on the hiring freeze says nothing in this should be construed to impede the access to Social Security benefits. Or the OMB directive said, nothing in this one should be construed to impede access to Social Security benefits. But how are we operationalizing that? That's something we need to keep an eye on, because the hiring freeze was already in effect because we're under a continuing resolution. The SSA budget situation last year was already causing attrition after a decade of attrition among Social Security Administration staff because the agency has been underfunded for so long. So what that means for real people is that we have fewer people taking appointments in field offices, fewer people answering the phones, 10,000 fewer than we did a decade ago, even as the number of Social Security beneficiaries increases every single day. And so how that shows up, I was just at the Social Security Administration working until a week or two ago. The last statistics I saw on answering the 800 number, on average, people who abandoned their calls, who were a majority, abandoned them after 1 hour on hold. People who got through after an hour and a half on hold. That's not an adequate level of service that we're talking about right now. And kind of waving an executive order at it is not going to change that. The only thing that will change that is having adequate financing, adequate staffing, so that we actually have people answering those phones. That's the only way we can guarantee access to the Social Security benefits that people have earned. So I think we need to keep a really close eye on appropriations and on customer service at the agency, because without that access, you don't have those benefits.
I got called out yesterday during the membership meeting for having tattoos that are related to my work. And one that I have not yet gotten, but that I've talked about getting at different points, as you know, is eligibility does not equal access. Wendell, you wanted to get on that as well.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Kathleen said. I worry about this thing, which I don't know a whole lot about, where federal workers say if we resign by February 6th and we'll get pay through the end of September, if a lot of Social Security workers take advantage of that transition, whatever you want to call it, I think it's going to hurt the Social Security Administration's ability to do its job. The other thing I'll say is, that particular item, how much money Social Security Administration gets, is determined by the Appropriations Subcommittee, the Labor H1. And in that particular subcommittee, my former boss was a part of that for many years. You compete against NIH, childcare, Head Start, and there's not very much lobbying on behalf of the bureaucracy to make sure Social Security checks and the service that is required there. So I just think this is a very important point that needs addressing.
Thank you for that, Wendell. So start getting your questions ready. We're going to have a roving mic that's going to go around just in a moment. And before we do that, I'm going to give our panel one last quick down the line opportunity. And the question is, what do you see as the message to policymakers coming out of this survey? And Joel, I'll put you on the spot first because I think you might already have an answer to that while everyone else figures out their answer.
Well, I think given that one of the options in every one of the choices was no change, and people rejected that as the option, people want action. People want there to be change to the program, but not to make it worse, to make it better.
And I think there was actually a video you did with a beneficiary where I saw him say that if you're going to mess with Social Security, make it better, don't make it worse. That guy summed it up pretty well. Tracey, same question to you.
Yeah, I think I would highlight this is a bipartisan issue. I mean, this is something that we need to act on, and everyone agrees that we need to act on it. And so I think that just pushing for, we all agree that something needs to change and people are willing to make hard choices and make those changes. I think we just have to keep kind of beating that drum because it is odd at this point that we are not able to see any action and we're waiting for kind of the longest period of time before we do.
Yeah, that conventional wisdom that it's the third rail, that doesn't seem to be what people are saying here, right? They're saying touch it and make it better and close the financing gap. Wendell, same question to you.
Well, just building off of what Tracey said, I mean, the truth is you cannot do Social Security on a reconciliation bill. So it does take 60 votes in the Senate, which means you do need bipartisanship, which I think is just very important. The other thing I'll say, just in terms of policy, I think in the report you talked about a bridge benefit. I want to give credit to the moderator of this and Tracey and Jack Mulligan. This thing will roll out on February 11th. We'll have a bridge benefit in terms of disability.
I'm so glad to see it showing up there and lots of people talking about that idea. Kathleen, same question to you. What do you see as the message to policymakers?
Be brave. I think that, there's been so much fear of dealing with these issues, but when you look at people facing these hard choices, the voters facing these hard choices, they're stepping up, they're being brave, they're saying, I'm willing to pay more, I'm willing to sacrifice because this program is important to me. And we need to see some of that courage from our policymakers too.
Be brave, says Kathleen Romig in her bright yellow. She has to balance me out because I always wear all black. Jason, same question to you, message to policymakers.
So one, I think Kathleen's right about being brave, but the one thing we don't see in Congress these days is courage, which concerns me. So I think a message that I would have, especially for Republicans, is that part of the equation for any Social Security solvency package will have to include revenues, period. The longer we wait to get to that package, the larger the revenue change will have to be on the tax side. So you are better off doing something earlier rather than later. You're better off doing this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It'll just be worse if we wait 9 more years at trust fund depletion. So the time for action literally is now.
Jason's talking to Elon Musk about financing a time machine, but until that happens, we do have to work on this in the present moment. So I think we've got some questions queued up in the back, and we have a mic ready to go to people who have questions. So first question, and if you could say your name and any organizational affiliation you have.
All right, Carl Polzer, Inequality Inc., INK, advocate for the bottom 50% and explore differences in income and inequality. I'm really happy to see these results, and I was really pleased to see some distributional analysis, like the difference between low, medium, and high wage earners and what they think. So a lot of the remedies, the policy changes, some of them are regressive, some of them are very regressive, and some of them are progressive. And if we had sample sizes big enough to match, different types of workers by income, to see if they understand this. With some of the remedies, that would be great. So my question is kind of for Matt. And like one of the I'm really happy to hear the comments about the raising the age. I wrote a paper for the Society of Actuaries 4 years ago that really hammered home on this. That's very regressive. So anyhow, I'm going to stop, but putting in a plug for distributional, data.
Can we actually have a quick discussion about the retirement age? Because Joel mentioned something in the first panel and Wendell brought it up in this panel. And what Joel said was, and it's basically all else equal, if you raise the retirement age, it's a benefit cut. However, if all else is equal and longevity increases, not raising the retirement age is an automatic benefit increase. And what Wendell mentioned is that there's a big disparity now based on wealth about longevity. And so I think we need to be a little bit to that point, Carl, about when we're talking about retirement age, it's no longer a one size fits all. So the question is there a way we can think about this more for those who are able to work longer, to make sure that we encourage them and help them do so? Because if they're wealthy enough to live longer, if they're living to 100, they're going to get great benefits from Social Security. And if that's based on wealth, then they're getting a higher Social Security monthly amount for a longer period of time. So I think we need to have a more nuanced discussion about retirement age.
Yeah, Jason, I really appreciate you bringing that up. And Carl, thank you for your comments and for the plugs for some of your work. And Jason, I think it is so important, right, to have a nuanced conversation when we talk about who's living longer, right? I think it was maybe just a few years ago that the conventional wisdom in Washington and really around the country was everyone's living longer, right? Which was some of what had everyone thinking, oh, well, maybe raising the retirement age across the board is what we should do. But we've come to understand, as more distributional analysis has been done, that not everybody is living longer and that it's actually happening. There's real differences on an income gradient. And so while we're putting in plugs, I'll put in a plug for the Older Workers Retirement Security Task Force that the Academy convened prior to my stepping into this role, which AARP was also a partner in, and Joel and Tracey were both involved with. That report found that's exactly right. Not everybody is living longer, and that there are huge numbers of people who would be harmed by further raising the retirement age, who are those lower income, middle income workers. But as you've pointed out, Wendell, there are people at the top who maybe would not be harmed as much. So I know, Wendell, you want to add to that too.
Yeah, so I'll give you the audience one factoid. So if you look at a 1960 cohort and look at their life expectancy at age 62, which would have been 2022, the bottom quintile, the bottom 20% of male wage earners live 15 more years. The top quintile lives 25 more years. So that's a spread of 2/3. I mean, the top quintile lives 2/3 longer than the bottom quintile. And that also means Social Security isn't nearly as progressive as we think of it is, even if you just look at the benefit formula. So I think that should be teased out. I mean, I strongly would advocate against raising the retirement age, but maybe we just raise it at the top and not at the bottom.
So a lot of food for thought there. I think we have another question in the back, and a mic is coming to you. And Steve, if you want to say your name and where you're from.
Hi, yeah, I'm Steve Nunez of the Roosevelt Institute. This is going to maybe be an annoying question because it's about the politics and the message to the policymakers. So I love conjoint analysis. It's such a huge advantage over the basic issue polling. But I'm always struggling with what to do with it, right? So on the first level, there is like meta-conjoint analysis, which is this is something in a broader bundle of goods, which is the policy platforms that people are going to be presenting and people are going to be voting on, right? So how important is this versus all the other things, immigration and so forth, that are often thought of as part of the bundle? But then the second thing is, so this is an optimization frame that you can induce in people if you put them in that scenario. But I'm thinking of the mid-century kind of work around politics and public opinion, like Converse 65 and so forth. And you could basically say that people if you're being charitable, have a sort of a rational ignorance. And if you're not being charitable, they're totally incoherent, right? So basically you think about this, right? They take their cues from leaders. And I wonder how stable are these preferences going to be if the debate actually opens up and you have somebody saying, no, that's bad, or yes, this is good, right? They're not going to necessarily be in that frame. They're going to say, well, Trump says this, or Harris says that, or whatever, and they're the people that I trust, so therefore I'm going to go with whatever they say. So again, like, how do you use this sort of thing as a policymaker when you're actually imagining that the preferences are not stable? They're in fact endogenous to demagoguery at worst, and arguments, good faith arguments at best.
Steve Nunez has many superpowers, but one is to ask the really, really hard questions. I'm curious who on the panel has thoughts, and I think we could probably take that in a lot of directions and also probably continue a conversation at lunch about that. Matt, it looks like you have thoughts. Are you raising a hand? All right. What do you want to come on up? Yeah, hang on. Don't say anything smart before we give you a mic. Do we? No, don't do that because the internet will not hear you. So do we have a roving mic that can come up to Matt real quick in the front so that he doesn't have to jump up on a stage? No, not yet. There we go.
Two thoughts on stability. Number one, we did a survey similar in 2014 and found the results very much like what we found now. Now we had some differences, but basically was of the same ilk, which suggests some level of stability. But the second thing that makes me think they're stable is Social Security is an issue which affects people personally. They're putting money in and they're getting money back or seeing their parents, et cetera, get back. And that makes me feel it's going to be more stable than other issues which are more esoteric. They know less about, they're more open to suggestions by other people. So those two things make me feel if we did this 10 years from now, it would be very similar. And the basic thing is Social Security is extremely important to older people's finances, and they don't want benefits cut, and they're willing to pay some more to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you for that, Matt. And I think it is a really important advantage of engaging in similar polling over time. And so thank you to the folks who did the work in 2012 and 2014. This is not the exact same instrument, but there are real similarities that do allow us to look over time. And it is interesting to see where there is so much similarity. What other thoughts do folks on the panel have to that question? Jason's got some.
Well, I think part of this comes into, I agree with you. People go, right, we're so tribal these days that everyone goes in their camps, right? They don't want to listen to their side. But this is a bipartisan issue, and the only way it's going to get done is on a bipartisan basis, which means if we have a bipartisan agreement and both parties go out together holding hands and saying we're jumping off together, that'll get the support. The problem is we don't have the political courage yet for people to go out together and say this is a plan.
Tracey.
My only other thought on that is that I think that it's kind of telling how much Trump has claimed that he doesn't want to hurt Social Security. Like, it's almost, we don't necessarily believe everything that is said in different administrations and different, groups. But I think that the idea that Social Security is special, that it's something that people have earned and that we need to protect it, that is a bipartisan kind of note. It's something that everyone says, whether or not, they come out with policies that we all agree on may differ. But I think everyone is saying that. It's not in the same way unpopular. Who doesn't like Social Security? Who does like Social Security? Everyone claims to like Social Security. It's what do we do about it?
I think so much so that we've seen quite public moments at the State of the Union, for example, where if people get told that they support cuts, we have people standing up and saying, no, we don't, right? So I think we have time for one more question, and we'll take it in the front here, and then we'll give you guys some instructions about lunch.
It's David Nixon. David Nixon, it appears to me, I like the thoughts of the panel, that this is both an opportunity and a responsibility for the Democrats, in the sense that Trump has been talking about how he supports Social Security and how important it is, but the fact is that inaction is the result of inaction is cuts. And I think beyond that, without a strong Democratic advocacy for sustaining the program and doing it by maintaining benefits, that the inevitable bipartisan agreement is going to sort of split the baby between tax cuts, some revenue increases and some benefit cuts, which is what happened the last time around. Whereas I think if the Democrats really begin to make this an issue now, they can change that dynamic significantly and make it hard to make a solution. First of all, force a solution, and second, make it hard for that solution to be sort of split the baby half and half. So I wonder what people have reactions to.
Thank you for that, David. I know, Jason, you've got thoughts. I can feel you thinking something in
This is one.
response.
So I'm on record. I don't know if Bill or Nolan is still here because he has an ongoing bet with me whether what I'm saying now is right or not. But when candidate Biden was running, Candidate Biden was saying he was going to be a one-term president and was going to bridge the divide, and he didn't turn out to do that. But I was thinking that President Biden could have been the president to save Social Security because he would be a one-termer, not running for re-election, and it takes Democratic leadership to get this done. Now we're in a second Trump administration. We're not going to see any of the next 2 years. It's unified Republican control. Democrats aren't going to stick their neck out and do anything in minority except for trying to oppose Trump policies. But if history's any indicator, the Republicans will lose the House in 2026. The Democrats will take it back. I'm not sure what the Senate, but that gives an opportunity for some bipartisan work on fiscal solvency for Social Security. And it seems that this current president has an ego. And I could see someone going to him and whispering in his ear, hey, don't you want to be the guy that saves Social Security and go down in history? Looks really good on a coin. So maybe there's a chance in 2027 and 2028 for a bipartisan commission or something that is led by a Democratic House, a Republican President, Donald Trump, that comes out and tries to save Social Security. If we don't do it then the next president runs and you're going to be basically at trust fund depletion.
Other thoughts from the panel on?
I just want to know if we would get benefit checks or we'd be paid in Bitcoin.
It's the Trump meme coin. He'll have a big, Superman, like I saved Social Security, that will be on the coin. I can't handle that right now.
I am at my limit, Jason. No, I'm just kidding. Any other thoughts on that point? Great points from David. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have to see leadership from Democrats, of course. But if we're going to hold hands and jump, we also have to see leadership from Republicans. And like over the past decade, no Republican has put forward a serious proposal on Social Security financing. Democrats have. So I think, if there is any need for leadership in this, I actually think it is more from the Republican side because it's got to be bipartisan. And that means both parties have to be seriously engaging on these issues.
Sam Johnson did put forward a plan.
A decade or more ago. Yes.
Well, no, and to that, that is an important point, though, Jason, and I think it is something you and I have talked about. I'm curious just on David's point, right? Democratic leadership needed, but Kathleen makes a really important point. And so I think you're the person on the panel who maybe has the best insight here. How do we get there to where we see Republican leadership on this issue? And how do we get there to where we see Republican leadership that starts to resemble anything close to what their constituents want them to do?
Yeah, I don't know. I think if President Trump doesn't do it in the last 2 years, if someone doesn't get to him that this could be a way for him to go down in history as a fantastic president, like on this issue, I don't see how it gets done until we get near trust fund depletion and the issue is forced upon him. And the one thing we're good at seeing Congress do, and Congress is good at, is waiting until the last minute. And they always seem to agree to borrow money. And the concern I have, and Wendell mentioned this too, because of our current deficits, our current debt, our current interest payments on the debt. In 9 years, if you think about trying to fill Social Security deficit just on borrowing, it's about $400 billion a year. Is it at that point where the bond market says, you know what, we're just done? And no, we're not going to let you borrow that much money.
So we're going to have to leave it there, but I will put in a plug that there is lots more where this came from in the report, which just went live this morning. And you can find that at the National Academy of Social Insurance website. Another huge thank you to all of our panelists, to Jason, to Kathleen, to Wendell, to Tracey, to Joel, and to AARP and the Chamber of Commerce and to the National Institute for Retirement Security for all the partnership, and to the Greenwald team for making this happen. As Matt said, it was a journey, and it was a journey we very much enjoyed being on with you all last year. And thank you to all of you who were reviewers of the report. You know who you are. And to Catherine Edwards, who played a really significant role in helping us to make this report happen. It takes a village to do this kind of work, and it's been a joy to do with all of you.